The mess hall was alive, steel trays clattering like distant artillery, boots dragging over polished concrete, men talking in the rough, overlapping rhythm of soldiers who'd earned the right to be loud. The air smelled of coffee, burnt halfway to bitterness, disinfectant, and something metallic that never quite washed out of uniforms. Noon sunlight spilled through tall windows, laying down stripes of gold across faces too young to know how old they looked. At the center of it all sat Dalton Reeves, broad, shouldered, easy, smiling, one of those seals who carried confidence like armor. His laugh was the kind people leaned toward. Around him, his team followed his lead, a small empire of arrogance disguised as camaraderie. It wasn't cruelty, it was habit, the kind of carelessness that grows when men forget what silence costs. The doors at the far end opened with a squeal, unnoticed at first, until the figure who entered didn't move like anyone else. The old man wore a faded uniform, the older kind, heavy fabric, sleeves rolled once with surgical precision. His boots made no sound. He carried his tray with both hands, slow, deliberate, as though every step was measured against memory. A faint scar traced the right side of his neck and disappeared into his collar. Nobody looked twice. Not yet. He moved toward an empty table near the corner, alone, unnoticed, until Dalton's voice carried not cruel, not kind, just loud enough to make everyone hear. "Hey, Pops," he said, with that grin that always earned laughter. "You forget where the museum's at. Lunch is for the living, not for exhibits." A wave of chuckles rose. Soldiers, hungry for entertainment, fed off the sound. The old man paused halfway to his seat. He didn't flinch, didn't turn. He simply looked down at his tray, adjusted his grip, then continued walking. Dalton smirked, leaning back, proud of his timing. "Come on," he added. "What was your rank back in the day, old timer? Bet it's been a while since anyone saluted you." The laughter returned, but thinner now, more uncertain. There was something about the way the old man finally turned his head. Not fast, not defensive, but slow, measured, a kind of stillness that quieted even those who didn't want to stop laughing. His eyes were pale, the blue of washed-out denim, the color of sky over water where too many ghosts lived. For a long moment the air stood still. Forks paused midair. The young seals looked between Dalton and the stranger, waiting for the punchline. But the old man spoke first, and his voice wasn't what anyone expected. "I didn't hold a rank," he said softly, his tone carrying across the mess hall without needing to rise. "I earned every inch of it." The room didn't laugh this time. Even Dalton's grin wavered, though he tried to hold it. "That right?" he said, forcing bravado that suddenly felt small. "And what rank was that, sir?" He threw the last word out like bait, playful, mocking, yet touched by something involuntary. The old man's gaze didn't waver. His face gave nothing away. "Master Chief," he said finally, a heartbeat past. "SEAL Team 2, Vietnam." The clatter of a dropped fork broke the silence. Someone whispered something inaudible, and then nothing. The room froze as if caught in amber. Dalton's pulse stuttered in his throat. SEAL Team 2 wasn't a legend. It was a myth whispered through generations. The first ones, the ones who had no manuals, no tech, just grit and silence and the jungle for a coffin. The old man turned back toward his table, sat down, and began to eat with the same slow precision as before, unbothered by the silence strangling the air around him. He didn't look at Dalton again. He didn't need to. Dalton felt the weight of every eye turned toward him, not in judgment, but in the collective awareness that something sacred had just been disturbed. For the first time in years, his throat was dry, and no words came. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder now. Trays clinked awkwardly. Conversation resumed in broken fragments, but laughter didn't return. It couldn't. Dalton's chest tightened with something that wasn't guilt exactly, more like realization, the kind that arrives too late. He thought about the tone of his voice, the arrogance laced in it, and how easily he'd spoken without knowing what kind of man he was addressing. Across the hall, the old veteran ate alone, eyes down, completely at peace with the silence he had created. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no pride, no sense of triumph, only calm. Dalton's team avoided looking at him. Pride tasted different now, bitter, raw. He looked down at his untouched meal and suddenly couldn't remember why he'd been laughing in the first place. And though no one said a word, the entire room understood the same unspoken truth. Some men carry wars inside them that others only joke about. The rest of the meal was a silence no one wanted to own. Dalton sat frozen, eyes on his untouched plate, the echo of the old man's words ricocheting inside his skull like rounds he couldn't dodge. Every laugh he'd ever thrown out so casually now felt like a confession. Across the mess hall, the veteran's slow movements carved through the tension like a blade through fog, quiet, deliberate, unbothered. When he stood to leave, the scrape of his chair on the floor sounded louder than anything else in the room. Dalton watched him go, the faded blue of his uniform, the way his shoulders didn't slump even under the weight of years. Something inside Dalton moved. He didn't know why, maybe guilt, maybe curiosity, but he stood too. His teammates watched him with wide eyes but said nothing. A few shook their heads. It wasn't their business anymore. Outside, the afternoon sun burned low, spilling gold across the asphalt of the base yard. The old man was walking slowly toward the chapel that sat by the cliffs, where the wind always smelled of salt and iron. Dalton jogged to catch up, but slowed when he was close, suddenly aware that his boots were too loud. "Sir," he called, softer this time, not to command attention, but to ask permission to exist in the same air. The veteran stopped but didn't turn. His posture was steady, his shadow long and thin on the ground. "I didn't mean any disrespect," Dalton said, his voice catching on the words. "I was just kidding around." The old man turned then, and his eyes, calm, pale, steady, met Dalton's. "Son," he said quietly, "the battlefield doesn't care if you are kidding. Disrespect gets people killed not just in war, but in peace too. It makes you forget what you're standing for." Dalton swallowed hard. He didn't argue. For once, words abandoned him completely. The veteran didn't seem angry. There was no pride, no demand for an apology. Just a weight, the weight of someone who'd seen too much and found no joy in proving anyone wrong. "Were you really with SEAL Team 2? Dalton finally asked, almost whispering. The man's expression didn't change. "Yes," he said simply. "We didn't have the name then. Just a number, a flag, and orders nobody believed we'd survive. Vietnam was heat and mud and ghosts. We did what we had to, and we stopped talking about it the moment we came home." Dalton looked down, shame burning his skin. "I didn't know, sir." The old man's mouth curved, not a smile, just the shadow of one. "You weren't supposed to. Men like me, we're meant to fade. But we stay quiet so you can speak loud. That's how it works." He took a slow breath, eyes drifting toward the sea. "You've got power now, more than we ever did. But power without humility is just noise, and noise gets soldiers buried." Dalton listened like a boy listening to his father for the first time. Every word sank deep, lodging somewhere behind the ribs. He wanted to ask more about the war, about the brothers lost, about what it meant to carry so many names and never say them aloud, but the veteran's gaze stopped him. It wasn't unkind, it just said, "You wouldn't understand yet." The wind shifted, somewhere, a flag cracked softly against its pole. Dalton stood straighter without meaning to. The veteran stepped past him, the scent of sun and sea on his clothes, and paused. "Son," he said, "you'll meet men one day who have done more than they'll ever tell you. Don't test them, just listen." And then he was gone, walking toward the small white chapel at the edge of the base, where the shadows fell like long, thin crosses. Dalton watched until he disappeared inside. He stayed there for a long time, the sun dipping lower, painting everything in bruised gold. The world felt quieter now, as if something inside it had been rearranged. When he finally turned back toward the mess hall, the laughter inside had softened, careful now, aware of itself. His teammates looked up as he re-entered, expecting a joke or an excuse, but Dalton just sat down quietly. He didn't explain where he'd been. He didn't need to. Something fundamental had shifted. The world had grown larger, older, and for the first time, Dalton realized that respect wasn't a performance. It was a discipline. Later that night, he lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He could still see the veteran's steady gaze, the weight of it, the calm beneath it. The phrase echoed in his head like a vow. Power without humility is just noise. He didn't sleep much that night. But when morning came, he woke with a new kind of stillness in his chest, the kind that comes after a man finally learns the difference between being strong and being right. Days passed, but memory refused to fade. Dalton Reeves went through his routines as always: drills, maintenance, weapons checks, yet every motion felt heavier, slower, like the echo of that quiet confrontation still clung to his shoulders. The veteran's words had taken root somewhere deep, twisting into thoughts Dalton didn't know how to name. The mess hall felt different now. Every time he walked in, he could sense it, the lowered voices, the respectful glances toward the empty table near the corner where the old man usually sat. The seat was untouched most days, as though it belonged to something sacred. The young SEALs had stopped joking about him. Nobody called him Pops anymore. They didn't even whisper his name, mostly because no one knew it. The old veteran was a presence, not a person. A quiet reminder that even in a world built on pride, silence could command more than any shouted order. Dalton noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The way the new recruits rushed through their drills, trying to impress. The careless way they handled their weapons when the instructors weren't watching, the laughter that sometimes followed near mistakes. He saw himself in them, that same hunger to prove, that same blindness to humility. And every time, he remembered the look in the old man's eyes, that calm, unflinching patience carved by decades of survival. One evening, after a long training day, Dalton walked down to the beach that bordered the base. The sun was a burning disk sinking behind the water, and the waves glowed orange under it. There, sitting alone on a bench, was the veteran. His posture hadn't changed, straight, backed, still, hands folded like a man who understood the weight of waiting. Dalton hesitated before approaching. "Evening, sir," he said quietly. The old man didn't turn. "Evening, son." His tone was soft, but his eyes never left the horizon. Still trying to figure it out. Dalton sat beside him. Figure what out? The man chuckled, the faintest sound, like dry leaves shifting. How someone can live long enough to stop needing to prove they exist. He looked at Dalton then, the corners of his mouth lifting faintly. "That's what men like you struggle with. You fight the war outside and forget the one inside." Dalton said nothing. The wind carried the smell of salt and oil from the docks. Somewhere, gulls screamed like old memories. "Back in '69. The veteran continued. "We didn't have drones, satellites, or air cover. We had mud. We had machetes, and we had each other. I lost 5 men in a single night, all younger than you. You think that kind of thing leaves you? No, you carry it. You just learn not to show the limp." Dalton's chest tightened. "Why keep coming here, sir, to this base?" The old man looked back toward the water. "Because this is where they train the men who came after us. I watch, I listen, sometimes I remember. That's enough." They sat in silence for a long while, watching the horizon swallow the sun. Dalton finally said, "You know, when I first saw you walk into the mess hall, I thought you were just some retired guy looking for free food." The veteran's mouth curved slightly. "And now I think you're the only real soldier I've met." The man didn't respond, but a faint light softened his features, not pride, not approval, just quiet acknowledgement. "You'll learn, Reeves. Someday you'll have to carry silence, too. When that day comes, carry it well." The words felt like a command, though they were spoken like a blessing. That night, Dalton couldn't sleep. He walked through the base alone, the quiet hum of distant generators the only sound. He stopped by the memorial wall, a slab of stone that caught moonlight like glass. Hundreds of names etched into it, each one a story untold. As he read through them, he wondered how many belonged to men like that old veteran, men who'd gone into darkness so that others could live in light. He found the strength to ask his commanding officer about him the next morning. The CO gave him a long, unreadable look. "That man's name isn't in our current registry," he said. "He trained recruits here a long time ago, back when the teams were still learning what they were supposed to be. He was a master chief, one of the first to wear that trident. Half the men who became legends learned under him. You could say we're all still walking in his shadow." Dalton didn't ask more. He didn't need to. The story was enough. From that day, things shifted in him. He still led his team, still laughed sometimes, but something had been tempered inside. The sharpness had dulled, replaced by steadiness. He started listening more than he spoke, training his men not with anger but with patience. He repeated something the veteran had said whenever tempers flared: "Respect first. The world will teach you later if you were wrong." It became his quiet mantra. Months rolled by, the rhythm of deployment and downtime turning into a blur. The veteran came to the mess hall less and less. Sometimes Dalton would see him across the yard, his slow, measured steps framed by sunlight, and sometimes only the empty bench by the sea. Each time, Dalton would feel the same quiet weight in his chest, the knowledge that some presences prepare you for things you can't yet imagine. He didn't know it yet, but his test was coming, and when it arrived, the old man's lessons would be the only thing standing between life and loss. The ocean was in, black when the mission went wrong. Dalton's team had been inserted under cover of night, an extraction deep in hostile territory, meant to retrieve a captured operative before dawn. The plan was clean on paper, it always was, but under the water the world didn't care for plans. A storm had rolled in from nowhere, bending the waves into walls of fury. Their comms cracked with static. Visibility was gone. What began as precision had descended into chaos. Dalton broke the surface gasping, salt water searing his lungs. The air was thick with the taste of metal and rain. Behind him, two silhouettes struggled against the tide. One man was shouting Garza his seconding command, his voice hoarse. "We lost Reyes. He's gone under." Dalton's heart slammed. He turned toward the darkness, scanning. Nothing but white spray and the roar of waves. For a second, he froze, every instinct screaming that it was hopeless. But then, faintly, he saw movement. A flicker, a hand he dove without thinking. The cold swallowed him whole, the pressure clamped against his skull, the current dragging him sideways. He reached out blindly, lungs already burning, until his fingers brushed cloth Rey's vest. He pulled hard, kicking upward, but the current resisted, a living, merciless thing. His mind roared with memory. "You'll learn to carry silence too. When that day comes, carry it well." He broke the surface with Reyes in tow. Garza hauled them onto the small inflatable boat, both men coughing up water. Dalton's chest heaved, his limbs trembling with exhaustion. The radio sputtered again, and the commander's voice crackled through the static. "Abort mission. Repeat, abort. Rendezvous point Bravo 6 compromised. You are to exfil immediately." Dalton looked at his team, 4 soaked men, their faces ghostly in the lightning. They had minutes before enemy patrols reached the shore. One wrong decision and they'd vanish like stones in the tide. He steadied his breath. "We're not leaving without the package," he said quietly. His voice was calm, almost eerily so. "They're holding him in the lower compound. 2 guards, maybe 3. We move now. We can make it." Garza stared at him. "You're crazy, boss. We're half dead already." Dalton met his eyes. "You think that old man on base survived half a century by waiting for easy?" There was no answer, just a shared look of grim resolve. And then they moved. The next half hour blurred into shadow and gunfire. Dalton's thoughts narrowed to breathe, motion, instinct. Rain lashed against his face as they breached the compound. 2 guards dropped silently. A third turned too late. They found the captive broken, bloodied, but alive. As they carried him out, an explosion ripped through the courtyard. Shrapnel hissed past Dalton's ear. He shielded the injured man, pain tearing across his side. By dawn, they reached extraction. All 5 men alive, though barely. Dalton collapsed onto the ramp of the helicopter, vision swimming. He tasted blood, salt, and adrenaline, and somewhere inside him, the echo of that old voice. Weeks later, back on base, the medics cleared him for duty, but something had changed. The arrogance that once defined him was gone, replaced by something quieter, deeper. His team noticed first. Orders carried more weight when he spoke softly. Mistakes were met with patience, not anger. Respect had rooted itself in him like an unshakable truth. One afternoon, when the base was calm, Dalton returned to the mess hall. The bench by the window was empty again. He hadn't seen the veteran in weeks. An unease crept through him, a quiet knowing that he might never see him again. He went to the memorial wall, and there, near the bottom under layers of dust and years, he found the name. Master Chief Samuel W. Harlow. The inscription below read, "The quiet anchor in every storm." Dalton's throat tightened. He stared at the name until the letters blurred. The world felt impossibly still. For a moment he could almost hear the man's voice again, calm and unwavering. "Carry it well." He raised his hand in a slow salute, the gesture steady despite the tremor in his fingers. Around him, the wind whispered through the yard, carrying the faint scent of the sea. That night, during dinner, the recruits were laughing again, young, loud, fearless. Dalton watched them, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. When one of them cracked a joke about old soldiers, Dalton stood and said quietly, "You'll meet one someday. When you do, remember, you're not looking at the past. You're looking at the reason you still have a future." The room fell silent, not out of fear but respect. Outside, the ocean thundered against the shore, timeless and endless. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the legacy of men like Harlow lived on, not in medals or rank, but in the way others stood a little taller, spoke a little softer, and carried their silence with grace. Dalton walked out into the night, his shadow long beneath the floodlights. The sea wind caught his uniform, pressing it against his frame. He stopped at the edge of the pier and looked out at the dark water. He didn't need to say a word. He'd learned the language of silence, and now he carried it well.